Chapter 1 Anthropocene on a Runaway Train to a Hellish Climate. Think of our planet like a freight train, accelerating along its tracks on a high mountaintop where life flourishes. The top is near an equilibrium of amazing abundance and stability that life has evolved to fit into for thousands of years. But downhill on the tracks lays an inhospitable desert, with heat so unbearable as to wither nearly all life to death. For thousands of years, the train has remained on the top, moving very slowly back and forth, with the climate relatively stable. The mountaintop is the only place full of life in its grand abundance and diversity, albeit heavily trampled by past environmental abuses. While very degraded, it still has most of its constituent parts, and above all, the climate as we know it, critical to the survival of the great diversity of life today, including us. It is only up on the mountaintop, with that relatively stable interglacial climate, that creates the vast array of life that we have today. On the top, our planet is easily repairable into its far grander former abundance when hundreds of millions of salmon return to the rivers of California, Oregon, and Washington states to feed millions of Native Americans, and tens of millions of buffalo roamed the Great Plains. But on down the tracks, all hope of restoration or preserving the remaining wonders of our planet are beyond hope. Keeping our 7 billion plus people alive will be near impossible in the climate down the mountainside. The loss of stable rainfall for crops, rivers overflowing their banks, sea levels rising, increased frequency of hurricanes and tornadoes, and tropical diseases in temperate regions threaten massive loss of life. Realize the seriousness of this issue. We are not talking about remote speculation. This is the undeniable course that we are on. Just look at the Arctic sea ice and all the documentation in this book. The permanence is eerie. When working to save 3,000-year-old redwood and sequoia trees, the age of the giants is impressive. Now we are talking about shifting to a climate not seen for 55 million years, threatening to wipe out the vast majority of species alive today, including those that have survived tens of millions of years, and threatening the survival and quality of life of most of our own species. That is the train we are on, whether we want to deny it or not, and we had better wake up, because we are the ones fueling its motion down toward a hellish oblivion of mass suffering, chaos, disease, and death. Our vision has been clouded by the wonders and might of our civilization's ever-growing technological power that makes us feel impervious to all threats. The fuel for the train is fossil fuel consumption and deforestation. Those most knowledgeable of the climate situation of today beg people to take heed of the gravity of the situation we face and realize how much we depend upon natural systems to provide our basic needs of clean air with oxygen, clean water, and food. These are the systems that are collapsing in the climate crisis. The fact that we have increased carbon dioxide levels 37% and methane 150% in our atmosphere puts any thought that we are insignificant influence to rest. The science is clear that it is our activities that have caused the changes. How do we listen to the credible warnings of 2 decades ago. We could have made the adequate investment to switch to a fossil-free infrastructure that also solves so many other problems and greatly improves our health by nearly eliminating pollution. We likely could have stabilized carbon levels and begun to reduce them to 350 parts per million carbon dioxide, the amount in 1987, as top scientists say is necessary. Instead, we have increased carbon dioxide emissions a record 2.9% in 2007 and 3.5% in 2008, more than 3 times the rate of increase of the 1990s. The reason is the power and corruption of the world's political systems by the coal, oil, and auto industries, which have invested their fortunes into coal and oil reserves and gas guzzler futures. Their investments would be near worthless if we could meet our energy needs through renewable power and travel primarily by fuel-efficient trains. In the beginning half of the 20th century, industries abused their power by buying up tracks and turning them into roads so that the oil, auto, and tire companies could increase profits. This hastened the demise of passenger rail as the primary mode of transportation. Next, oil companies bought patents for fuel-efficient cars that were then kept off the market, and both oil and coal companies bought patents for solar panels and wind generators to keep them from production. Now, these industries are engaged in multi-billion-dollar campaigns against efforts to tackle climate change and shift to renewable energy. Coal and oil industries have massively pushed the freight train Earth toward the precipitous edge of the mountainside at an accelerating pace. Instead of investing their billions of dollars into renewable energy and energy-efficient improvements, the fossil industries are orchestrating the release of vast amounts of carbon stored for hundreds of millions of years in our ever-expanding coal mines and oil and gas fields. Chances of stopping this train from roaring down the mountain into a hellish climate grow increasingly lower every second of every minute of every hour of every critical day in these pivotal times. The technological might that has moved mountains for coal and highways is all based on fossil fuels that are running out and that we should not be burning. It would be near impossible to push freight train Earth back up the mountain if we let it go down. The slope in this metaphor is caused by what scientists call positive feedback. This is where the warming we have initiated triggers natural mechanisms that cause more warming, a runaway greenhouse effect, until a new stable climatic system is reached. The problem is that next stable condition is about 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, last seen 55 million years ago, when tropical conditions existed in the Arctic and Antarctic regions. We are unleashing great forces of nature that are just now being understood, that can force our climate into inhospitable levels, not just for the 60% of the planet's species already known to be threatened with extinction this century, but for humanity as well. The scale of the melting ice in the Arctic to alter Earth's temperature exceeds that of all the fossil fuels we have already burned. The permafrost contains twice as much. Then there are the methane hydrates that scientists believe were the largest factor in reaching the superhot conditions seen 55 million years ago, when most of the life on our planet was wiped out. This is frozen methane that has been stored thousands of feet deep on the ocean floor throughout the world. It contains 3,000 times the amount of methane in the atmosphere today, and there are signs it is beginning to melt, releasing bursts of methane that bubble to the surface. The Arctic sea ice is like a switch that rockets the planetary train to overdrive when melted. With ice conditions year-round in almost all of the Arctic, as was seen until recent years, it acted like a brake on the train, reflecting much of the sun's energy, giving us a fighting chance to stop before we go over the edge. Once sea ice melts, warming conditions threaten to rapidly melt permafrost and possibly even methane hydrates, collapse, catapulting the planet to super hot, deadly conditions. When a house is on fire, you get outside. What do you do when the whole planet is burning? The horrific conditions of the destination into which we are headed is the most troubling, and something few scientists realized until very recently. Several years ago, many would have described my analogy in terms of a flat surface, that once we get that climate train moving, it can be hard to stop and could cause horrendous damage with a few degrees temperature rise. But few understood that once we get it moving past a certain threshold, the slope takes over, and even if we stop the engine, it is going down toward the unbearable conditions none of us would want to leave to future generations. We take for granted the life support system in nature that keeps humanity alive far too much. We are talking about the life or death of billions of people, not to mention millions of other species. Such is the value of the climate on the mountaintop for our beloved Earth. The critical element that brings life-giving rains at just the right amount and time and temperature ranges in which all plants and animals are evolved to fit. Climate change has turned from a few degrees warming about which we should be concerned to a likely terrifying lurch into such temperature extremes that the very survival of the majority of humanity this century is being put into question by top scientists like Sir James Lovelock. We are triggering so many positive feedbacks of such a gigantic scale that the runaway greenhouse effect that we are unleashing could exceed the worst case IPCC predictions of 6.4 degrees Celsius this century, which are already horrific. Our planet is in critical condition, the situation very dire. But an optimist at heart, as all activists inherently are, or they would just sit on the sidelines, I will never give up hope. To give up hope that we can make a difference, since it is our species that has caused the crises, is the ultimate nail in the coffin of the welfare of all life on our planet for all foreseeable time to come. Through the collective ingenuity and the might of humanity, we need to mobilize for the enormous needed changes. For now, the best thing to do is speak up persistently and demand strong action from government and industry leaders, while trying to reduce our own carbon footprint. All of the effects detailed in this book, as horrific as they are bound to get much worse very fast. Even with no new emissions, our planet will continue to warm for another 35 years as there is a thermal inertia with the length of time that it takes for the oceans to absorb heat. Also, through the global dimming caused by all the soot pollution in the atmosphere, We are about 2 degrees cooler than we otherwise would be. Ironically, if we were to immediately stop burning fossil fuel and wood fires, temperatures would immediately rise in just a few days. But we surely can't keep burning fossil fuels either, or on down the tracks to a deadly climate we go, with no way back. The 220 billion tons of greenhouse gases we have already emitted have moved the train to where the slope is beginning to take over. Meanwhile, we are fueling the locomotive with 3 times the global emissions of a decade ago, and the slope increases as we go down the tracks. Drastic change needs to be made very fast, and we need more people demanding faster action from lawmakers and industry. Through a broad understanding of the facts presented in this and similar books by the citizenry of our planet, we can work to collectively realize that the issue is not our lifestyle, it is our survival, and particularly the survival of future generations that is at stake. Working with organizations such as Greenpeace, I began asking for action on climate change in 1989. Then few understood the threat global warming presented. It was after working for a year with Ozone Action, which merged with Greenpeace USA in 2000, that I realized how serious the issue was. I spent 6 weeks in The Hague, Netherlands, at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, working with Greenpeace to show support from the U.S. for strong, mandatory cuts in emissions. I was impressed with Greenpeace as they combined banner drops with suit and tie negotiations very effectively and professionally. Greenpeace activists chained themselves to a coal barge, shutting down Rotterdam Harbor. I witnessed Greenpeace activists chain themselves to the truck they stopped in the middle of the road in front of the UN building. They took the tires off and poured cement onto the chained-in volunteers. Meanwhile, a siren blared, an effort to sound the alarm on this issue that we should have made number one back then. I cheered support for the brave souls willing to risk death to get the message out on this critical issue. I also passed out flyers explaining the purpose of the demonstration, along with dozens of other Greenpeace volunteers. One of the facts that startled me the most was how 42% of the polar ice had melted in the prior 40 years. Having trekked through the Arctic wilderness, I began looking into it in much greater depth. 2 years prior, Greenpeace sent researchers up to the Arctic to get witnesses to the change that scientists knew was occurring, and publicize those findings. Greenpeace wanted to work to educate Americans on global warming and raise the level of concern, said Dan Ritzman, who worked on the project. The second component was we wanted to do something directly to combat climate change. Greenpeace was unique in that it is international, and they did the science to prove that we are getting to the critical point of no return. We cannot burn a quarter of our known reserves, so there is no point in finding new reserves. We should use that effort to find renewable energy